On April 8, 1918, a Montessori school in Santa Barbara, California called Boyland was raided by federal agents. 5 people, including its superintendent and proprietor, were arrested. Prynce Hopkins, an heir to the singer-sewing machine fortune and founder of the school, was targeted for his pacifist writings and was charged under the Espionage Act of 1918. An editorial that appeared in the Santa Barbara Daily News and the Independent a year before his arrest wrote, "He is engaged in a stealthy attempt to overthrow the very government that has nurtured him, and under which the fortune he has inherited was acquired." Was Hopkins really a criminal anarchist set on overthrowing the U.S. government? Or was there more to Hopkins than the headlines suggest? Hi there. I'm Jessica Peel-Austin, Curator of Museum Collections at Brucemore, a National Trust for Historic Preservation site. Our archives offer some insight into his life, and I'm here to share that history with you. Prynce Hopkins was born on March 5, 1885, to parents Charles Harris Hopkins and his third wife, Mary Isabel Booth Hopkins. His father worked for the U.S. Mint in San Francisco and was a shrewd investor. He inherited shares of Singer Sewing Machine Company following the death of his second wife, Ruth Merritt Matthews Singer, one of the many daughters of notorious philanderer Isaac Merritt Singer. Prynce's name was originally spelled Prince. However, as he grew older, he found this to be an embarrassment. When he was visiting Paris in 1906, he was stopped by a policeman for speeding, and later wrote, "On this occasion, for the first time in my life, this name, which has caused me many embarrassments, stood me in good stead." I handed my card to the agent. He scrutinized it and then, bowing respectfully, said, "Passez, Monsieur le Prince." Nevertheless, he experimented with spellings and eventually replaced the I with a Y. Prynce's parents traveled widely in his younger years, largely due to his father seeking treatments for chronic kidney and bladder issues that plagued him. Sometimes Prynce traveled with his parents. Sometimes he was sent to boarding schools, and sometimes lived with family friends. He later attributed the depression and anxiety he experienced to his constant shifts between parents and foster parents. In 1898, when he was 11 years old, the family built a permanent home at 1900 Garden Street in Santa Barbara that they named El Nido, or the Nest. They became prominent members of Santa Barbara society, and their lives would begin to cross with that of the Douglas family of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who would take their winters there starting around the same time when El Nido was constructed. Prynce was an intelligent and curious young man, and his social status had earned him the advantage of having access to exceptional schools and tutors. He was accepted to Yale with the goal of studying mechanical engineering. He was fascinated by the idea of human flight, and in 1906, Prynce applied for a patent of a helicopter. Though he was never able to get it produced, he was one of several inventors who produced iterations of the machine that wouldn't be successfully created until 33 years later. He continued his education at MIT, pursuing a master's degree in engineering, but he was unhappy in Boston. He transferred to Stanford to study aeronautics, but his grades suffered. He fell into a depression and puttered at this and that, much to his practical father's chagrin. Prynce eventually decided on education and returned to school at Columbia, pursuing a degree in educational psychology. He earned his master's and began his working life as a hypnotherapist. In 1911, Prynce fell ill with tuberculosis and was sent to Pottinger's Sanatorium in Monrovia, California. With little else to do, he spent the majority of his time reading. He credited his reading Tolstoy's War and Peace for converting the young 7th Regiment conservative who had entered Pottinger's into a critic of our social order and a convinced pacifist. Hopkins was coming of age at the height of the Progressive Era, and he seemed to be struggling to reconcile his own affluence with the problems caused by rapid industrialization, political corruption, and the concentration of wealth that he saw around him. His ability to travel and to move within social circles across the country, afforded by his wealth, ironically gave him access to some of the most important thinkers of the time. During his time in New York, he had begun attending meetings of anarchists. One of the most prominent anarchist figures was the author and speaker Emma Goldman. Goldman had become well known throughout the country as an activist involved in some of the biggest events of the time in the U.S. She was accused of conspiring during the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania, where her partner, Alexander Berkman, attempted to murder industrialist Henry Clay Fripp. In 1901, Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist, attempted to assassinate President William McKinley and claimed to have been inspired to do so by Goldman. Goldman was detained for weeks despite having no involvement with Czolgosz. At the time that Hopkins was introduced to Goldman, she was authoring Mother Earth magazine and was traveling the country on speaking tours. By 1914, Europe was at war with itself and the US supplied weapons to the Allies, but the idea of entering the war remained unpopular. The US ultimately did enter the war on April 6, 1917. Following the declaration of war, Goldman saw the Selective Service Act of 1917 as militant aggression and organized the No Conscription League of New York. Her anti-conscription work ran her afoul of the newly enacted Espionage Act, and she and Alexander Berkman were again arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Around this time, another of Prynce Hopkins' friends was also getting involved in anti-conscription activism. Roger Baldwin and Hopkins had also met in New York. Baldwin was a Harvard-educated lawyer who had been practicing in St. Louis until around 1917. Like Goldman, he was concerned about growing militarism and became a leading figure in the American Union against militarism. As a lawyer, he was also concerned about the treatment of wartime dissidents, conscientious objectors, and labor union members. And, like Goldman, he too was arrested during this period, his crime violating the Selective Service Act. Following his release, in January of 1920, he founded the American Civil Liberties Union. He and Hopkins remained lifelong friends. To cheer Prynce up during his recovery at Pottinger's years earlier, his father had promised to purchase him some land outside of Santa Barbara on which he could embark on his latest idea, founding a boys' school. During his time at Columbia, he had discovered his love of teaching and education. In 1913, his father purchased for him 14 acres of land in the Riviera neighborhood of Santa Barbara for him to build his school. His father did not live to see the completion of that project, however, passing later that year. Prynce felt estranged from his father at that time, but was grateful for the inheritance he would receive. He said, "I felt so gratified that now I would be able to put his wealth to many good uses." In 1915, the first school campus was completed, and he named the school Boyland. That school was so successful that it almost immediately needed a larger campus. In June of that year, he purchased another 30 acres of land and started construction on a bigger, more elaborate Boyland. Prynce's plans for Boyland were extravagant, to say the least. The plans included, he said, wonderful waterfalls, supplying a large lake in the center of which would be the world's continents represented in miniature. He planned to create English, Japanese, French, and Italian buildings and gardens so the students could sit in the environments they were studying about. Hopkins became interested in the Montessori method after attending Dr. Maria Montessori's training program in San Diego. The Montessori method emphasizes self-directed learning in a prepared environment, which was particularly appealing to Prynce. The resulting building was impressive and modernistic and opened to students on October 8, 1917. It was smooth sailing for Boyland until April 8, 1918, the day before Prynce gave a speech to a group of International Workers of the World Union members. Prynce had also been writing pacifist propaganda for several years at this point. His recent titles, The Ethics of Murder and More Prussian Than Prussia, gained him the notice of federal authorities. Boyland was likely selected as a target because in More Prussian Than Prussia, he made reference to the Montessori method. Neither piece, however, was particularly radical. In total, 5 Boyland employees were arrested, and Prynce was arrested in Los Angeles under the Espionage Act of 1918. At first, Prynce took a defiant stand, but his lawyers persuaded him to plead guilty of, quote, having written books and made speeches which might have interfered with recruiting. He was fined $25,000 and his companions $10,000. Many other pacifists during this period were receiving long prison sentences, but the judge read Prynce's book and found it, quote-unquote, inoffensive. So why am I telling you all of this? You might remember that I mentioned that the Douglas family began taking their winter months in Santa Barbara around the time that the Hopkins completed their family home, El Nido. Irene Douglas, wife of George B. Douglas, industrialist and heir to the Quaker Oats fortune, and owners of Brucemore, were close friends of the Hopkins family. Irene's diaries and letters contain countless references to invitations to tea, dinner, and walks with Mrs. Hopkins. They were such close friends, in fact, that Margaret Douglas, Irene's eldest daughter, listed Mrs. Hopkins as her emergency contact in her 1911 to 1915 diary. The Douglas families were Santa Barbara regulars, spending every winter in the city while Margaret and her sisters were growing up. It's not surprising then that Prynce and Margaret were acquainted, though he was 11 years older. In April 1915, Margaret was ecstatic when one of her teachers mentions Prynce during a lesson. Her diary reads, "Nearly fell out of my chair when she mentioned Santa Barbara and a man that she knew that had a school there. Prynce Hopkins?" Another entry in 1918 mentions Prynce again, this time as one of the men vying for her attention at a dance. "Danced all evening. Prynce and I made quite a hit. Liked Mr. Andrews the best." A few days later, Prynce takes Margaret out for a date. "Prynce took me to El Mirasol for dinner and to see Grumpy afterwards. He certainly is a queer duck, but most interesting." Another few days later, Prynce again calls on Margaret to take her to a swimming party, but she declines. Aw, young love. Margaret doesn't mention Prynce again in any of her existent diaries, so sadly we don't learn of how she felt about the raid on Boyland, or if she even knew that it had occurred. We do know, however, that Prynce and her future husband Howard looked quite similar, and shared a love for pet monkeys. Sadly, the raid on Boyland was the end of the school. Many of the parents feared public disapproval and withdrew their students. Boyland was converted into a hospital during the 1918 flu pandemic. Then it was converted into a luxury hotel, but its success was short-lived, and then becoming a retirement home that operated for many years. Sadly, the structure no longer exists. Prynce left for Europe following his arrest. He went on to live a full and fascinating life. He married twice, had several children, completed his PhD in London, was arrested again alongside Upton Sinclair protesting for the rights of striking Los Angeles dock workers, founded another school outside of Paris, learned psychoanalysis, became one of the first anti-smoking advocates, continued to travel the world, and wrote several books. Prynce Hopkins passed away at his Santa Barbara home on August 16, 1970. We hope you've enjoyed learning about Prynce Hopkins, a true Renaissance man whose life intersected in fascinating ways with some of the most important figures of his day, and had a little romantic intrigue with our own Margaret Douglas Hall. For more stories of interesting people you may never have heard of, please subscribe and ring the bell. Thank you for watching.